A talented maid's life changes forever when her cruel employer invites her to a masquerade gala as a cruel joke, but when she shows up in a stunning red dress, she sets off a chain of events that will transform her from an invisible servant into a rising star in the design world, proving that success is the best revenge. But before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future stories like this one. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our global audience. Claire Bennett wiped the sweat from her forehead as she polished the marble floors of the Hawthorne mansion. Her hands were red and sore from hours of cleaning, but she kept going. She needed this job. At 30 years old, with dreams bigger than her bank account, she couldn't afford to slow down. Miss Bennett. The cold voice of Ethan Hawthorne made her jump. She looked up to see him standing there in his $1,000 suit, looking down at her with those steel grey eyes that never showed warmth. Yes, Mr. Hawthorne. Claire stood up quickly, trying to smooth down her uniform. There's going to be a party here next Saturday, a masquerade gala. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. You're invited. Claire stared at the golden envelope he held out. This had to be a mistake. In the 3 years she'd worked here, Ethan Hawthorne had barely spoken 2 words to her that weren't orders. Sir? Her voice came out uncertain. Take it. He pushed the envelope toward her. Unless you're too busy that night. No, sir, I'm not busy. Claire took the envelope with trembling fingers. Ethan's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good. I expect to see you there. It's a costume party, so wear something appropriate. As he walked away, Claire heard him chuckle. That's when she knew. This wasn't kindness. This was entertainment for him. Back in the servants' quarters, Claire sat on her small bed and opened the envelope. The invitation was beautiful, printed on thick cream paper with gold lettering. You are cordially invited to the annual Hawthorne Masquerade Gala. He's up to something, Rosa, the cook, said from the doorway. The older woman had worked for the Hawthornes for 20 years. She knew them better than anyone. That man doesn't have a generous bone in his body. I know. Claire touched the elegant paper. But I'm going anyway. Rosa sat beside her on the bed. Girl, why? You know he's probably planning to humiliate you in front of all those rich folks. Claire looked at the small mirror on her wall. She saw what others saw. A maid in a plain uniform, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. But she also saw something else. Something that had been hiding for too long. Because I'm tired of being invisible, Rosa. I'm tired of people like Ethan Hawthorne thinking they can treat us however they want, just because we clean their houses. Rosa shook her head. Pride can be dangerous, Claire. So can letting people walk all over you. Claire stood up and walked to her small closet. She pushed aside her uniforms to reveal a sketch pad hidden in the back. Opening it, she showed Rosa the drawings inside. Beautiful room designs, color schemes, furniture arrangements. I didn't go to design school just to spend my life cleaning other people's houses. Maybe this is a chance. A chance for what? To get your heart broken? To be laughed at by those society snobs? Claire smiled. A chance to show them who I really am. The next morning, Claire was cleaning the library when she overheard Ethan talking to his friend James in the hallway. You invited your maid to the gala? James laughed. That's cruel, even for you, Ethan. Oh, come on. It'll be entertaining. Can you imagine? Her showing up in whatever cheap dress she can find, trying to fit in with people who spend more on a pair of shoes than she makes in a month? Claire's hands tightened on her cleaning cloth. She should have known. Of course, this was just a game to him. But as she listened to their laughter fade down the hallway, something inside her hardened into determination. If Ethan Hawthorne wanted a show, she'd give him one, just not the kind he was expecting. That afternoon, during her lunch break, Claire walked to the small boutique 3 blocks from the mansion. The bell chimed as she entered, and an elegant older woman looked up from behind the counter. Can I help you? The woman asked, her eyes kind but curious. I hope so. Claire pulled out the invitation. I need a dress, something unforgettable. The woman, who introduced herself as Grace, took the invitation and read it carefully. Then she looked at Claire with new interest. The Hawthorne Gala, that's quite an event. May I ask how you got an invitation? Claire told her everything. About being the maid. About Ethan's cruel game. About her determination not to let him win. As she spoke, Grace's expression changed from curiosity to understanding to something that looked like conspiracy. My dear, Grace said when Claire finished, I think I know exactly what you need. She walked to the back of the store and returned with a garment bag. I've been saving this for someone special. She unzipped the bag and Claire gasped. Inside was the most beautiful dress she'd ever seen, a deep, rich red that seemed to glow like embers. The fabric was silk, flowing like water as Grace lifted it out. I can't afford something like this, Claire said, her heart sinking. Grace smiled. You know, I was a housekeeper once, many years ago. Now I own this boutique. Would you like to know how that happened? Claire nodded. Someone believed in me. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. Grace held out the dress. Now it's my turn to do the same for someone else. I can't accept. You can, and you will. Grace's voice was firm but gentle. Consider it an investment in your future. Besides, her eyes twinkled, I want to hear all about Ethan Hawthorne's face when you walk into that party. As Claire left the boutique that day, carrying the garment bag like it contained gold, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not just for one night of glory, but for something more. Something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Back at the mansion, she hung the dress carefully in her closet. She had 1 week to prepare, 1 week to transform from the invisible maid into someone who could hold her head high among the city's elite. Every night after her work was done, she practiced walking in the heels Grace had given her. She watched YouTube videos about elegant posture and social etiquette. She studied the way the rich women who visited the mansion carried themselves, spoke, moved. And every time she heard Ethan's mocking laugh in the hallways, every time she caught him smirking at her as she cleaned, she thought of the red dress waiting in her closet. She thought of Grace's words, let them see the real you. The real Claire Bennett wasn't just a maid. She was a woman with dreams, talent, and determination. And in 1 week, Ethan Hawthorne and all his wealthy friends would learn that truth in a way they'd never forget. The night before the gala, Claire stood in front of her mirror, looking at her reflection. Tomorrow, everything would change. Whether for better or worse, she didn't know. But one thing was certain, she was done being invisible. Ready or not, Mr. Hawthorne, she whispered to her reflection, here I come. The morning of the gala arrived with a mix of sunshine and nerves. Claire woke up early, her heart pounding at the thought of what lay ahead. She still had her regular duties to perform. Ethan had made it clear that being invited to the party didn't mean she could skip work. You look like you're about to jump out of your skin, Rosa said, watching Claire clean the dining room windows with shaking hands. I am. Claire wiped her forehead. What if this is a huge mistake, Rosa? What if I make a fool of myself? Then you'll hold your head high and remember who you are. Rosa put down her feather duster and grabbed Claire's shoulders. Listen to me, girl. I've watched you work here for 3 years. I've seen how you handle yourself with dignity no matter how these people treat you. Don't let them take that away tonight. Claire hugged the older woman. Thank you, Rosa. Now go on. It's already 3 o'clock, and you need time to get ready. As Claire hurried to her room, she passed Ethan in the hallway. He was directing staff about the party preparations, but he paused to give her that smirk she'd grown to hate. Don't forget about tonight, Miss Bennett. I'm looking forward to seeing what you wear. I won't disappoint, Mr. Hawthorne. Claire kept walking, hiding her smile. He had no idea what was coming. In her small room, Claire took a long shower, washing away the day's work. She dried her hair carefully, following the YouTube tutorials she'd studied all week. Her hands trembled as she applied her makeup. Not too much, just enough to enhance her natural beauty, just as Grace had shown her. Then came the dress. Claire lifted it from the garment bag with reverence. The red silk gleamed in the late afternoon light. She slipped it on, and the fabric settled against her skin like a whisper. The dress fit perfectly as if it had been made for her. It hugged her curves without being tight, the color making her dark skin glow. Grace had also given her a pair of elegant black heels and a simple gold necklace with matching earrings. Sometimes less is more, she'd said while helping Claire try everything on. Looking in the mirror, Claire barely recognized herself. Gone was the invisible maid in her plain uniform. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged in the pages of a fashion magazine. A knock at her door made her jump. Claire, it's me, Rosa. Claire opened the door and Rosa's eyes went wide. Oh, my Lord in heaven. Is it too much? Claire asked nervously. Too much? Child, you look like a queen. Rosa circled her, taking in every detail. That Ethan Hawthorne won't know what hit him. Claire checked her phone. It was almost 7. The party would be starting soon. She could already hear cars arriving, the murmur of voices from the grand entrance hall. I think I'm going to throw up, Claire said. Rosa handed her a small glass of water. Take deep breaths. Remember, you have as much right to be there as any of them. More even. You were invited. Claire nodded, took one last look in the mirror and picked up the delicate black mask that Grace had included with the outfit. It was time. The main house was already full of people when Claire made her way toward the grand staircase. She paused. In the shadows, watching the crowd below. Everyone was dressed in their finest, masks of all kinds hiding familiar and unfamiliar faces. She spotted Ethan easily. He was wearing a black tuxedo with a golden mask, standing near the bottom of the stairs with a group of his usual friends. They were laughing about something, and Claire had a pretty good idea what, or who, was the subject of their amusement. Looking for someone? A voice behind her made her turn. It was James, Ethan's friend, who had laughed about her invitation. He clearly didn't recognize her. Just taking in the view, Claire said smoothly, grateful that her voice didn't shake. James offered his arm. Allow me to escort you down. A beautiful woman shouldn't have to enter alone. Claire placed her hand on his arm, fighting back a laugh at the irony. This was the same man who had called her the help just last week. As they descended the stairs, heads began to turn. The conversations nearest them quieted. Then the silence spread like ripples in a pond. By the time they reached the bottom step, the entire entrance hall had fallen silent. Claire saw the exact moment Ethan noticed her. He was mid-laugh when his eyes landed on her, and the sound died in his throat. His champagne glass froze halfway to his lips as he stared. My God, someone whispered nearby. Who is she? James led her to the center of the room, where other couples were beginning to dance. May I have this dance? He asked. Claire smiled behind her mask. Thank you, but I think I'll get a drink first. She moved through the crowd with deliberate grace, feeling Ethan's eyes following her. People stepped aside as she passed, whispering to each other. She heard fragments of their conversations. That dress, never seen her before. Must be from out of town. At the bar, she ordered a champagne. The bartender, who had worked at the mansion for years and knew her well, did a double take, but managed to hide his surprise quickly. Here you are, miss, he said with a wink as he handed her the glass. Claire was taking her first sip when she felt someone approach. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. She could feel Ethan's presence behind her. I don't believe we've met, he said, his voice carrying that familiar note of arrogance. I'm Ethan Hawthorne, your host. Claire turned slowly, letting him see her fully. She watched as his eyes traveled from her shoes up to her face, lingering on the curves that her uniform had always hidden. Oh, but we have met, Mr. Hawthorne. She reached up and removed her mask, enjoying the way his face changed as recognition dawned. Many times, in fact, usually while I'm cleaning your house. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. The crash drew everyone's attention, and suddenly all eyes were on them. Ethan's face went from shocked to angry to calculating in the space of seconds. Claire, he tried to keep his voice down. What do you think you're doing? Exactly what you invited me to do, Mr. Hawthorne. She smiled sweetly. I'm attending your party. Is something wrong? Before he could answer, James appeared at his side. Ethan, who is this enchanting woman? You must introduce us properly. This is, Ethan started, but Claire cut him off. Claire Bennett. She extended her hand to James. We've met before, actually. I believe last week you were discussing with Mr. Hawthorne how entertaining it would be to watch his maid try to fit in at this party. James's face went pale. Around them, the whispers grew louder, but now they had a different tone. His maid invited her as a joke. How cruel. She looks amazing. Ethan grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her aside. You're making a scene, he hissed. No, Mr. Hawthorne, Claire said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. You made a scene when you invited me here as a joke. I'm just refusing to be the punchline. She pulled her arm free and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there with his mouth open. As she moved through the crowd, she heard the unmistakable sound of approval. Subtle nods, small smiles, even a few quiet claps. The night was young, and Claire Bennett was just getting started. The real show was about to begin, and for once she was the star, not the stagehand. The party was in full swing, but the atmosphere had changed. Claire could feel it in the way people looked at her now, not with pity or amusement, but with interest and respect. She stood near one of the tall windows, sipping her champagne, watching as whispers about her confrontation with Ethan spread through the crowd. That was quite an entrance, said a deep voice beside her. Claire turned to see an older gentleman in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Victor Montgomery, he introduced himself with a slight bow. Claire's heart skipped a beat. Everyone knew Victor Montgomery. He was one of the biggest names in real estate development in the city and Ethan's biggest competitor. Claire Bennett, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh, I know who you are now, the whole room does. Victor smiled. I must say, you've made this evening far more interesting than these stuffy parties usually are. Before Claire could respond, a woman in a stunning blue gown joined them. Victor, darling, aren't you going to introduce me to the woman who just put Ethan Hawthorne in his place? Margaret, this is Claire Bennett. Miss Bennett, my wife, Margaret. Please, call me Maggie, the woman said, linking her arm through Claire's. Come with us. You simply must meet some people. The next hour passed in a whirlwind as Maggie Montgomery introduced Claire to what seemed like half of New York's elite. To Claire's surprise, no one seemed to care that she was a maid. If anything, they were impressed by her confidence and grace under pressure. So, Claire, Maggie said as they sat at one of the elegantly decorated tables, tell me what you did. Before working for that awful man, I studied interior design actually, Claire admitted, but life had other plans. Interior design? Victor leaned forward, suddenly interested. Do you still do any design work? When I can. I keep a portfolio of ideas. Claire stopped, wondering if she was saying too much. Show me, Maggie demanded, pulling out her phone. Do you have any photos? Claire hesitated, then took out her own phone. She pulled up the digital portfolio she'd created of her sketches and design concepts. Her hands shook slightly as she handed it to Maggie. Victor, look at this, Maggie exclaimed, swiping through the images. These concepts are exactly what we've been looking for the Crawford project. Victor studied the designs carefully. Fresh perspective, unique use of space. Miss Bennett, would you be interested in meeting with our design team next week? Claire almost choked on her champagne. Yes, of course. Across the room, Ethan watched this exchange with growing anger. He'd spent the last hour trying to damage control, telling anyone who would listen that this was all a misunderstanding. But people seemed more interested in talking to Claire than listening to him. She's making... You look like a fool, James said, joining him at the bar. You need to do something. Ethan downed his scotch. Oh, I will. He strode across the room, interrupting Claire's conversation with the Montgomerys. I need to speak with my employee, he said coldly. Privately. Your employee? Victor raised an eyebrow. I believe Miss Bennett is a guest at this party, Ethan, just like the rest of us. It's all right, Claire said, standing. I'll speak with Mr. Hawthorne. Ethan led her to his private study and closed the door. The music from the party became muffled and suddenly they were alone. What do you think you're doing? He demanded. Talking to Victor Montgomery? Showing him your little drawings? Making connections, Claire replied calmly. Isn't that what these parties are for? You're making me look bad. No, Mr. Hawthorne. You did that all by yourself when you decided to use me as entertainment. Ethan stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. I could fire you right now. Go ahead. Claire met his gaze steadily. But I think the Montgomerys might have just offered me a better position anyway. You actually think they were serious? Ethan laughed, but it sounded forced. They were just being polite. Nobody's going to hire their maid as a designer. Maybe not, but at least I'll know I stood up for myself. Claire turned to leave, but Ethan grabbed her arm. We're not finished. The door opened, and Victor Montgomery stood there, his expression. Jerk, I believe you are finished, Ethan. Take your hand off the lady. Ethan released Claire's arm as if it had burned him. Victor, this is a private conversation. Not anymore. Victor turned to Claire. Maggie's looking for you, my dear. She wants to discuss color schemes for the Crawford project. Claire walked out with her head high, leaving Ethan alone with Victor. You're making a mistake, Ethan said to Victor. She's nobody. That nobody just showed more class in one evening than you have in all the years I've known you. Victor's voice was cold. And by the way, Ethan, that merger we were discussing, I think I'll be taking my business elsewhere. Back in the ballroom, Claire found herself surrounded by admirers. Women wanted to know where she got her dress, men asked her to dance, and everyone seemed eager to hear her story. I don't understand, she said to Maggie during a quiet moment. Why is everyone being so nice to me? Maggie smiled knowingly. Because you did what everyone in this room has wanted to do for years. You stood up to Ethan Hawthorne. That man has been throwing his weight around, making people feel small for far too long. Tonight, a maid in a red dress showed him that money can't buy class. As if on cue, Ethan stormed back into the ballroom. His face was red with anger, and he made straight for the bar. People moved out of his way, but not with the usual deference. This time they were trying to hide their smirks. "One more thing," Maggie added, watching Ethan. "That merger Victor mentioned, it was worth millions. Ethan just lost it because he couldn't stand the idea of his maid stealing his spotlight." Claire felt a mix of emotions, guilt, satisfaction, and something else she couldn't quite name. She hadn't come here tonight to ruin Ethan's business deals. She just wanted to prove she wasn't someone he could mock and dismiss. "Don't feel bad," Maggie said, reading her expression. "Sometimes people need to learn their lessons the hard way." "Now about that job offer. Victor wasn't just being nice. We really do need someone with fresh ideas for the Crawford project. Are you interested?" Claire looked around the ballroom, at Ethan brooding at the bar, at the glamorous people, who now smiled at her like an equal, at the life she'd never thought she could have. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm very interested." "Wonderful." Maggie pulled out a business card. "Come to this address on Monday morning, 9 o'clock sharp. And Claire," she squeezed Claire's hand, "wear something red. It suits you." The party continued into the night, but everything had changed. The woman in the red dress wasn't just a curiosity anymore. She was the star of the evening. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Claire thought of Grace and her little boutique. She couldn't wait to tell her how her investment had paid off. As for Ethan Hawthorne, he left his own party early, claiming a headache. But everyone knew the truth. He couldn't stand to watch his perfect world shift on its axis, all because he'd underestimated a woman he thought was beneath him. The next morning, Claire would hand in her resignation. But tonight, she danced, she laughed, and she showed everyone exactly who Claire Bennett really was. Not just a maid in a red dress, but a woman ready to step into her power. The morning after the gala, Claire woke up in her small room feeling like she'd dreamed the whole thing. But there it was, the red dress hanging on her closet door and Maggie Montgomery's business card on her nightstand. She got dressed in her uniform one last time. Today would be different. Today would be her last day as Ethan Hawthorne's maid. When she stepped into the kitchen, Rosa was already there making coffee. The older woman took one look at her and broke into a huge smile. "There's my girl." Rosa hugged her tight. "The whole staff is talking about what happened last night. Even Thomas the gardener heard about it, and he wasn't even at the party." Claire sat down at the kitchen table, accepting a cup of coffee from Rosa. "I still can't believe it really happened." "Believe it, and not a moment too soon." Rosa lowered her voice. "Mr. Hawthorne's been in his study since dawn, making phone calls and yelling at people. I heard him tell his lawyer to find a way to void some kind of merger agreement." "The Montgomery deal," Claire said, feeling a twinge of guilt. "Don't you dare feel bad about that man's problems," Rosa warned, pointing a wooden spoon at her. "He brought this on himself." Before Claire could respond, the kitchen door swung open. James, Ethan's friend from the party, walked in. He looked surprised to see Claire sitting there in her uniform. "Miss Bennett," he said awkwardly. I came to apologize for my behavior, both at the party and before." Claire set down her coffee cup. "You mean when you were laughing about the maid trying to fit in with high society?" James had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, I was wrong. We were both wrong. And after seeing how Ethan's behaving this morning, I'm starting to realize just how wrong we've been about a lot of things." "What do you mean?" "He's falling apart. Up there, calling in favors, threatening people, trying to save his deals. But the more he pushes, the more people are pulling away. Nobody likes a bully who's been exposed." Claire stood up. "I need to give him my resignation." "Be careful," James warned. "He's not in a good mood." Claire walked through the mansion's halls, remembering all the times she'd cleaned them, all the times she'd felt invisible as people walked past her. Not anymore. She knocked on the study door. "What?" Ethan's voice barked. Claire opened the door. Ethan was sitting behind his desk, his usual perfect appearance disheveled. Papers were scattered everywhere, and several coffee cups littered the desk. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm here to give you my resignation." He looked up, and his eyes narrowed. "Of course you are. Running off to work for Victor Montgomery? Do you really think you're qualified to design million-dollar properties? I guess we'll find out." Claire placed her resignation letter on his desk. "My last day is today." "You know what your problem is, Claire." Ethan stood up, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't know your place." "No, Mr. Hawthorne, your problem is that you thought you could decide what my place was." Claire met his gaze steadily. Thank you for the invitation to the gala. It changed my life. She turned to leave, but Ethan wasn't finished. You'll fail, he called after her. And when you do, don't come crawling back here for your old job. Claire paused at the door. You know what the difference is between us, Mr. Hawthorne? You were born into your success. I'm going to earn mine. She closed the door on his angry face and walked back to her room. It was time to pack. An hour later, Claire stood outside Grace's boutique carrying her small suitcase. Rosa had cried when they said goodbye, making Claire promise to visit. The other staff members had hugged her and wished her luck, many of them saying she'd given them hope that change was possible. The bell chimed as she entered the boutique. Grace looked up from her counter and broke into a wide smile. There's my Cinderella. I've been waiting for you to tell me everything. Claire set down her suitcase. Actually, I was hoping I could ask you for one more favor. What is it, dear? Could I stay with you for a few days just until I get my first paycheck from the Montgomerys? I'll help around the shop and… Grace cut her off with a wave of her hand. The apartment above the shop has been empty since my daughter moved out. It's yours for as long as you need it. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes. Why are you helping me so much? Because 30 years ago, I was you. Grace came around the counter and took Claire's hands in hers. I was a housekeeper who dreamed of owning my own business. Someone helped me, and I promised myself I'd do the same when I found someone worthy. The moment you walked in here, I knew you were that person. Just then, the boutique's door opened and Maggie Montgomery walked in. I thought I might find you here, she said to Claire. I hope you don't mind. I asked around and found out about the lovely woman who provided that stunning red dress. Grace beamed. Mrs. Montgomery, what a pleasure to see you again. You two know each other? Claire asked, surprised. Grace has been designing my evening wear for years, Maggie said. In fact, she's the one who told me to keep an eye out for a special young woman in a red dress at the gala. Claire turned to Grace in shock. You planned this. I merely suggested to Maggie that she might find some fresh talent in an unexpected place, Grace said with a wink. The rest was all you, my dear. Maggie pulled out some papers from her designer handbag. I know we said Monday, but I thought you might want to look these over today. It's your contract with Montgomery Developments. The salary is on page 3. Claire looked at the number and had to sit down. It was more money than she'd make in 5 years as a maid. Welcome to your new life, Claire, Maggie said warmly. Victor and I are having a dinner party tonight to introduce you to the design team. Nothing formal, just a small gathering of people who are excited to work with you. As Maggie left, Claire turned to Grace. I don't know what to say. Say you'll make the most of this opportunity. Say you'll prove Ethan Hawthorne wrong. Say you'll remember this moment when it's your turn to help someone else. Claire hugged the older woman tight. I will. I promise. Later that evening, as Claire prepared for dinner with her new colleagues, she looked at herself in the mirror of her new apartment. She wasn't wearing the red dress tonight. Instead, she had on a simple but elegant black dress that Grace had helped her choose. The woman in the mirror wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't just the lady in the red dress who had caused a sensation at a party. She was Claire Bennett, interior designer, ready to start her new life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. Ethan's been calling everyone, trying to find out where you went. I told him you moved on to bigger and better things. Show them what you're made of, girl. Claire smiled and grabbed her purse. It was time to step into her future, and she was ready for whatever came next. 1 month after the gala that changed everything, Claire sat in her new office at Montgomery Developments, looking out over the city skyline. Her desk was covered with fabric swatches and color samples for the Crawford project, her first major assignment as lead designer. Miss Bennett? Her assistant, Jenny, poked her head in. The clients are here for the presentation. Claire took a deep breath and smoothed down her navy blue blazer, another gift from Grace, who had practically adopted her over the past month. Send them in. The Crawfords were a wealthy couple in their 60s who had made their fortune in pharmaceuticals. They wanted their penthouse completely redesigned, and this was Claire's chance to prove herself. Miss Bennett, Mrs. Crawford said as they entered, we've heard so much about you. All good things, I hope, Claire replied with a smile, though her heart was racing. Oh yes, Mr. Crawford chuckled. The woman who stood up to Ethan Hawthorne is quite the talk of our social circle. But Maggie Montgomery says your talent is even more impressive than your courage. Claire pulled out her presentation. Boards. Well, let me show you what I've been working on. For the next hour, Claire walked them through her vision for their home. She'd spent weeks perfecting every detail. combining their love of traditional elegance with modern touches that would make the space feel fresh and unique. When she finished, both Crawfords were silent. Claire held her breath. "It's perfect," Mrs. Crawford finally said, wiping a tear from her eye. "John, it's exactly what we wanted." Mr. Crawford nodded. "When can you start?" "Really?" Claire couldn't hide her surprise. "You don't want to think about it?" "My dear," Mrs. Crawford took her hand, "we've seen 5 other designers. None of them understood us like you do. You have a gift." After the Crawfords left, Claire sat at her desk, still in shock. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "How did it go?" Before she could reply, Victor Montgomery walked in. "I just heard from the Crawfords," he said, grinning. "They're thrilled. You've done it, Claire. Your first major project." "I can't believe it's really happening," Claire admitted. "Believe it, and there's more." Victor sat down across from her. "Word is getting around about your talent. We've had 3 more high-profile clients specifically request you for their projects." Claire's eyes widened. "Already? You're becoming quite the sensation in certain circles." Victor's expression turned serious. "Which is why I need to warn you. Ethan Hawthorne has been making calls, trying to discredit you." Claire's happiness deflated a bit. "What's he saying?" "Nothing that's sticking. In fact, it's backfiring on him. The more he tries to tear you down, the more interested people become in the designer he's so threatened by." Just then, Maggie burst into the office. "Claire, darling, you'll never believe who I just had lunch with." "Who?" "Grace, and we've had the most wonderful idea." Maggie sat on the edge of Claire's desk, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "The Crawford project is going to be featured in Home and Style magazine when it's finished. They want to do a whole spread on you, the new rising star of interior design." Claire felt dizzy. "A magazine spread? And that's not all," Maggie continued. "Grace and I think it's time to get you your own place, something that really shows off your talent. There's a beautiful loft apartment available in my building." "Maggie, I can't afford—" "Nonsense. With the commissions from these new clients, you absolutely can. Plus, think of it as your own showcase. When people see how you've designed your own space, they'll be fighting to hire you." Victor cleared his throat. "Speaking of hiring you, the Ashworths called this morning. They want to meet about their Hamptons house renovation." "The Ashworths?" Claire gasped. "As in Ethan's biggest clients?" "Former biggest clients," Victor corrected with a smile. "They were at the gala that night. Mrs. Ashworth was particularly impressed with how you handled yourself. She says anyone with that much grace under pressure and an eye for design is exactly who she wants working on her home." Claire sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. A month ago, she had been cleaning the Ashworths' coffee cups when they visited. Ethan. Now they wanted to hire her. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Rosa. "Girl, you won't believe what's happening here. Ethan's going crazy. The Ashworths just called to cancel all their contracts with him. He threw a vase at the wall." "Are you okay?" Maggie asked, noticing Claire's expression. "Just processing everything." Claire showed them the text. "I never meant to hurt his business." "You didn't," Victor said firmly. "Ethan Hawthorne is hurting his own business. His attitude, his treatment of people, his attempts at revenge, it's all catching up with him. You just happened to be the catalyst that opened people's eyes." Maggie nodded. "Now, about that loft. Can I think about it?" "Of course, darling. But don't think too long. It's a very desirable property." After they left, Claire walked to the window looking out at the city. Her city. A month ago, she'd seen it from behind windows she was cleaning. Now she was designing the homes of the people who lived in its penthouses. Her phone buzzed with another text, this time from an unknown number. Her heart stopped when she read it. "Enjoy your success while it lasts. You have no idea what you've started. E.H." Claire's hands shook as she showed the text to Jenny. "Should we call security?" Jenny asked, worried. "No," Claire said after a moment. "Save the number but don't respond. If he wants to waste his time threatening me, let him. I've got work to do." She turned back to her desk and pulled out the plans for the Crawford project. She had a magazine spread to prepare for, after all. That evening, as Claire walked to Grace's boutique for their weekly dinner, she thought about how much her life had changed. The same streets she used to walk as a maid now felt different. She was different. Grace was waiting with a glass of wine and a knowing smile. "I heard about the Crawfords and the magazine, and the Ashworths." "News travels fast," Claire laughed. "In our circles, like lightning." Grace poured herself a glass. "Are you ready for what comes next?" "What do you mean?" "Success is one thing, dear. Handling it gracefully is another. And dealing with enemies like Ethan Hawthorne requires a special kind of strength." Claire thought about the threatening text. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Good, Grace raised her glass, because something tells me this is just the beginning of your story. Looking at her mentor's confident smile, Claire realized Grace was right. The red dress had opened a door, but it was up to her to walk through it. And despite Ethan's threats, despite the challenges ahead, she was ready. She was no longer the maid in the shadows. She was Claire Bennett, designer, businesswoman, and survivor. And her story was just beginning. 2 months into her new life, Claire was busier than she'd ever been. The Crawford project was moving forward beautifully, and her schedule was packed with client meetings. She had finally taken Maggie's advice and moved into the loft apartment, which she was slowly transforming into her own personal showcase. But success, she was learning, came with its own problems. "Miss Bennett?" Jenny rushed into her office one morning looking worried. "We have a situation. The custom furniture for the Crawford living room. It's all been cancelled." Claire looked up from her blueprints. "What? How?" "The manufacturer says they received a cancellation order last week. From you. That's impossible. I never—" Claire stopped as realization dawned. "Check who signed the cancellation order." Jenny pulled out the paperwork. "It's your signature, but—" Claire examined the signature. It was good, very good, but it wasn't hers. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Crawford. "Claire, darling." Mrs. Crawford's voice was tight with concern. "I just received the most disturbing call from Ethan Hawthorne. He said you've been using forged documents to make purchases for our project." Claire's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Crawford, I can explain. He sent me copies of some orders with apparently forged signatures. The police are involved, he says." "Please," Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Give me 1 hour to sort this out. I promise you, this is not what it seems." After hanging up, Claire called Victor Montgomery. "Already on it," Victor said before she could explain. "Ethan's been busy. He somehow got copies of your signature from your old employment papers and has been using them to cause trouble. But he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He got sloppy. Left a paper trail. My security team has been watching him since he started, making threats. We have proof that he's behind the forgeries." Claire sank into her chair, relieved. "So we can prove it wasn't me?" "Better than that. We can prove he's committing fraud. The police will be very interested in that." Just then, Maggie burst into the office. "Claire, have you seen the news?" She held up her tablet showing a gossip website. The headline made Claire's stomach drop. "From Maid to Fraudster, Rising Designer's Dark Secret." "There are pictures," Maggie said, scrolling down, "of you apparently accepting bribes from contractors. They're fake, of course, clearly photoshopped, but they're all over social media." Claire felt tears threatening but forced them back. "He's trying to destroy everything I've built." "No," Maggie said firmly. "He's destroying himself. Look at the comments." Claire looked. Under the article, dozens of people were defending her, calling out the obvious smear campaign. Many were sharing stories of their own experiences with Ethan Hawthorne's vindictive behavior. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Turn on. Channel 7 now." Claire grabbed the remote for her office TV. On screen was James, Ethan's former friend, giving an interview. "I can no longer stay silent," he was saying. "What's happening to Claire Bennett is part of a pattern of behavior I've witnessed from Ethan Hawthorne. He's been forging documents, manipulating the media, all because a talented woman dared to stand up to him and succeed on her own merits." Another text came in, from Ethan himself. "Last chance. Resign from Montgomery Developments, admit you. Forge the documents and this all goes away." Claire's hands stopped shaking. A strange calm came over her. "Jenny," she called to her assistant, "get me a press conference today and call Mrs. Crawford. Tell her to meet me at the penthouse in 2 hours. It's time to show everyone exactly what I can do." 2 hours later, Claire stood in the Crawfords' penthouse. The space was half finished, showing glimpses of the elegance to come. Camera crews from 3 networks were setting up their equipment. Mrs. Crawford arrived looking uncertain. "Claire, what is this about?" "Trust me," Claire said, taking the older woman's hands. "Let me show you what's really been happening with your home." As the cameras rolled, Claire walked Mrs. Crawford and the viewers through every detail of the design process. She showed original sketches, material samples, and most importantly, her detailed documentation of every decision and purchase. "These are the real orders," she explained, displaying the paperwork, "with my real signature, verified by 3 different banks. And these," she held up the forged documents Ethan had created, "are the fakes. Notice the difference? Forensics. Experts who Victor had brought in explained the technical details of how they could prove the forgeries. James appeared in person to testify about what he'd witnessed, and then came the surprise guest, the owner of the furniture company. "Mr. Hawthorne approached me 6 weeks ago," the man testified on live TV. "He offered to double my usual fee if I would help him discredit Miss Bennett. I recorded our conversation." The audio played and Ethan's voice filled the room. "I don't care what it costs. I want her ruined. She needs to learn her place." Mrs. Crawford was crying by the end. "Claire, I'm so sorry I doubted you." "Don't be," Claire hugged her. "You were manipulated by someone who's very good at it. But that stops today." The press conference made national news. By evening, Ethan Hawthorne was facing multiple investigations, not just for the forgeries, but for years of similar schemes that people were finally coming forward about. Back in her loft that night, Claire received visitors. Victor, Maggie, Grace, and even Rosa, who had quit her job at the mansion as soon as the truth came out. "I always knew you were special," Rosa said, hugging her tight. "From the first day you started working at that house, I knew you were meant for better things." "We all did," Grace added. "That's why we helped you. But you're the one who did the hard part. You were brave enough to take the chances when they came." Claire's phone had been ringing all evening, clients calling to confirm they were standing by her, new clients wanting to hire her, even TV shows wanting interviews. "What happens now?" she asked Victor. "Now," he smiled. "Now you keep doing what you've been doing, designing beautiful homes, building your reputation, and showing the world who Claire Bennett really is. And Ethan will face the consequences of his actions," Maggie said firmly. "The police are at his house right now with a warrant." Claire walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the red dress that had started it all, now hanging in a place of honor in her closet. She thought about the long journey from maid to designer, from invisible to unstoppable. "You know what the best revenge is," she said finally. "Success. Real, honest, earned success." Grace raised her glass. "To success then, and to the lady in red who wasn't afraid to claim it." As they toasted, Claire's phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. "Miss Bennett, this is Detective Morgan. We have Mr. Hawthorne in custody. He's asking to speak with you. The choice is yours." Claire looked at her friends, her new family really, and typed her response. "No, thank you. I have nothing left to say to him. My work speaks for itself." 3. Months after Ethan Hawthorne's arrest, Claire stood in the newly completed Crawford penthouse, surrounded by photographers from Home & Style magazine. The space was everything she had dreamed it would be. Elegant, yet welcoming. Sophisticated, yet comfortable. "Just one more shot," the photographer said, positioning Claire near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "The light is perfect." Mrs. Crawford watched from the sidelines, beaming with pride. "I can't believe how beautiful everything turned out. You've made our house into a home, Claire." The magazine shoot was interrupted by Jenny rushing in, looking excited. "Miss Bennett, the nominations for the National Design Awards were just announced. You're on the list for Rising Star of the Year." Claire nearly dropped the design portfolio she was holding. "What? It's true." Jenny held up her tablet, showing the official announcement. "You're the youngest nominee in the category's history." The photographer started snapping pictures, again capturing Claire's genuine shock and joy. But before she could fully process the news, her phone rang. It was Victor Montgomery. "I assume you've heard the news?" he said when she answered. "But that's not why I'm calling. How would you feel about becoming a full partner at Montgomery Developments?" Claire had to sit down. "A partner? But I've only been here a few months, and in those months, you've brought in more high-profile clients than anyone else in the firm's history. The Crawford project is already being called revolutionary. You've earned this, Claire." That evening, Grace hosted a celebration dinner at her boutique. The small space was packed with Claire's supporters, the Montgomerys, Rosa, Jenny, and even James, who had become a good friend after helping expose Ethan's schemes. "To Claire Bennett," Victor raised his glass, "the newest partner at Montgomery Developments and future Design Star of the Year." As everyone cheered, Maggie pulled Claire aside. "Darling, there's something else we need to discuss. The annual charity ball is next month. As a partner in the firm, you'll need to attend." Claire's smile faltered slightly. The charity ball was the biggest social event of the year. It was where she had worked as a server just last year, watching from the shadows as the city's elite danced and networked. "Don't worry," Maggie squeezed her hand. "You're ready for this, and I have just the dress in mind." "Let me guess, Claire laughed. Something in red? Actually, no. Grace joined their conversation. I'm thinking gold, like a winner. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. The Home and Style article came out, featuring Claire's work on the Crawford penthouse. The response was overwhelming. Her phone didn't stop ringing with potential clients, but not everyone was celebrating her success. One morning, Jenny brought in a stack of mail that included an anonymous letter. You don't belong in our world. Go back to cleaning houses. Trash it, Claire said firmly. We don't have time for hate mail. The Ashworth project needs those new sketches by noon. Later that day, during a site visit to the Ashworth's Hampton house, Claire overheard two workers talking. Can you believe they hired Hawthorne's maid? One whispered. Must be some kind of publicity stunt. Claire cleared her throat, making them jump. Actually, they hired me because I'm the best person for the job. Now, about those kitchen cabinets. That night, alone in her loft, Claire called Grace. How do you do it? She asked. How do you handle people who can't see past what you used to be? You show them who you are now, Grace replied, and you never forget who helped you get there. Speaking of which, how's Rosa doing at the boutique? Claire smiled. After quitting the Hawthorne mansion, Rosa had taken Grace up on her offer to manage the boutique's new cafe section. She was finally pursuing her dream of running her own kitchen. She's amazing. Her pastries are bringing in customers from all over the city. See? Sometimes the best revenge is helping others rise with you. The night of the charity ball arrived all too quickly. Claire stood in front of her mirror, barely recognizing herself in the golden gown Grace had designed. It was sophisticated and elegant, with just enough sparkle to catch the light. Ready? Maggie asked, arriving to pick her up in her limousine. As I'll ever be. The ball was being held at the same hotel where Claire had worked so many events. As she walked in on Victor's arm, she remembered carrying trays of champagne through these same doors. The whispers started immediately. Is that Claire Bennett? The designer everyone's talking about used to be Hawthorne's Maid. Did you see the Crawford penthouse? Nominated for Rising Star, but this time the whispers weren't mocking. They were curious, admiring, even envious. Mrs. Ashworth rushed over to greet her. Claire, darling, you must tell everyone about your plans for my house. The ideas are simply brilliant. Soon Claire was surrounded by people who wanted to discuss design, who valued her opinion, who saw her as an equal. It was surreal. During a quiet moment, she slipped away to the service corridor, the same one she used to use during her breaks. A young server was sitting there, looking tired. Rough night? Claire asked, sitting beside her. The girl looked up, startled to see a guest in the staff area. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am, this area is for staff only, I know. Claire smiled. I used to work here, not too long ago. I was sitting right where you are. The girl's eyes widened. You're Claire Bennett. I read about you in the magazine. Is it true? Were you really a maid? I was, and I was good at it. But it wasn't my dream. Claire pulled out one of her business cards. What's your dream? I want to be a chef. I'm taking night classes, but call this number tomorrow. Claire handed her the card. Ask for Rosa at Grace's boutique. Tell her Claire sent you. She's looking for help in the cafe, and she loves teaching people who want to learn. The girl's eyes filled with tears. Why would you help me? Because someone once helped me. And success means nothing if you don't share it. Back in the ballroom, Claire rejoined the party with a lighter heart. She danced, she laughed, she discussed business with potential clients, and when she caught glimpses of the serving staff, she made sure to smile, to thank them, to treat them with the respect she had wished for when she was in their shoes. Late that night, as she was leaving, she overheard two society women talking. Can you believe she used to be a maid? No, what I can't believe is that none of us saw her potential sooner. Thank goodness for that red dress. Claire smiled to herself as she walked to her car. The red dress had opened the door, but she had walked through it on her own, and now she was holding that door open for others. Her phone buzzed with a text from Grace. How did it go? Perfect, Claire replied. But I think I just hired Rosa, a new assistant. Of course you did, Grace texted back with a laughing emoji. That's what makes you special, Claire. You never forget where you came from. Looking back at the glittering hotel, Claire felt at peace. She had found her place in this world, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who could bridge both worlds, and that, she realized, was her true success. The morning of the National Design Awards ceremony dawned bright and clear. Claire sat in her office at Montgomery Developments, trying to focus on work instead of her nerves. The ceremony was tonight, and her nomination for Rising Star of the Year had been making headlines all week. "Claire?" A deep voice from her doorway made her look up. Michael Drake, one of the city's most successful architects, stood there with a boyish smile. "Got a minute?" Claire's heart did a little flip. She and Michael had been working together on the Ashworth project, and there was definitely a spark between them. But she'd been hesitant to act on it. Office romances were complicated, enough without adding her unique situation to the mix. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "How's the structural planning coming along?" "Actually, I'm not here about work." Michael ran a hand through his dark hair. "I was wondering if you had a date for the awards ceremony tonight." Claire blinked in surprise. "No, I was planning to go with the Montgomerys. Would you consider going with me instead?" Before Claire could answer, Jenny burst into the office. "Miss Bennett, there's a problem at the Crawford penthouse. The pipes burst in the main bathroom. Water everywhere. Mrs. Crawford is frantic." Claire jumped up. "I'm sorry, Michael, I have to go," he smiled. "But think about tonight, I'll wait for your answer." At the Crawford penthouse, Claire found chaos. Water had seeped into the custom wallpaper she'd specially ordered from Paris, and the antique wooden cabinets were already showing signs of damage. "This is sabotage," Mrs. Crawford declared, wringing her hands. "The plumber says someone deliberately damaged the pipes." Claire examined the damage with the plumber. He showed her where the pipes had been tampered with, recently and expertly. "Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Crawford asked. Claire had a sinking feeling she knew. She'd heard Ethan Hawthorne was out on bail, awaiting trial. Back at the office, she found another anonymous note on her desk. "Still think you belong here? This is just the beginning. Everything okay?" Michael appeared in her doorway again. "You look worried." Claire showed him the note and told him about the Crawford penthouse. "How you need to call the police," he said, his face darkening with concern. "This is serious, Claire. I know, but I also need to fix Mrs. Crawford's bathroom before the magazine photographers arrive next week." She sank into her chair. "I can't let Ethan win. Have dinner with me tonight," Michael said suddenly, "before the ceremony. Let me help you forget about all this for a few hours." Looking at his kind eyes, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Yes to dinner and yes to being my date for the ceremony." His smile lit up the room. "I'll pick you up at 6. After he left, Maggie appeared almost immediately. "Was that Michael Drake I saw leaving your office?" With a rather large grin. "Maybe," Claire tried to hide her own smile. "About time." Maggie sat down. "Victor and I were wondering when you two would finally admit the obvious attraction." "Maggie, we're just going to dinner before the ceremony? Yes, he already called Victor to say he's stealing you from us tonight." Maggie's expression turned serious. "But what's this I hear about trouble at the Crawford penthouse?" Claire told her about the pipes and the note. "That's it," Maggie declared. "I'm calling our security team. If Ethan's behind this, we'll catch him." That evening, Claire stood in her closet staring at her dresses. The red one that had started everything, the gold one from the charity ball, and now a new one Grace had made for the awards ceremony. A stunning silver creation that seemed to float. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. "Don't forget to eat something before your big date. And girl, wear the silver dress. It's definitely a winner." At exactly 6, her doorbell rang. Michael stood there in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, holding a small bouquet of white roses. "You look—" He trailed off, staring at her in the silver dress. "Too much?" Claire asked nervously. "Perfect," he finished. "Absolutely perfect." Dinner was at a small Italian restaurant Michael said was his favorite. It was cozy and romantic, far from the spotlight they'd be in later. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said over pasta. "That night at the Hawthorne Gala in the red dress, were you scared?" Claire considered the question. Terrified, but also determined. "Why?" "Because that's when I first saw you. Really saw you. I was there as Ethan's potential client. When you walked in, everything changed. The way you handled yourself, your grace under pressure. I couldn't stop thinking about you, even knowing I was a maid. Especially knowing that. Claire, do you know what I love about your designs? They're beautiful, yes, but they're also real, livable. You understand that homes are meant to be lived in, not just looked at. That comes from your experience, from seeing how people really live." Claire felt tears threatening. "Most people think my background is a weakness. It's your strength, just like everything else about you." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. It was Jenny. "Turn on the news now!" Michael helped her pull up the news on his phone. The headline made them both gasp. Designer Claire Bennett's work revealed as fraud? Former employer claims she stole designs from his company. The story showed Ethan Hawthorne, looking somber in a suit, claiming he had proof that Claire had copied designs from his company's files while working as his maid. But that's impossible, Claire whispered. I never... Of course you didn't, Michael said firmly, and we can prove it. Your designs are completely original. Any expert can see that. The ceremony starts in an hour. Everyone will have seen this. Michael took her hand across the table. Then let them see how you handle it. Like you did in the red dress. Like you've done every time someone tried to knock you down. Claire squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his confidence. Will you help me? Every step of the way, he promised. When they arrived at the ceremony, reporters were waiting. They shouted questions about Ethan's accusations. Michael kept his arm around Claire as they walked the red carpet. Miss Bennett will address all questions during her acceptance speech, he told the reporters with complete confidence. Acceptance speech, Claire whispered. We don't know if I'll win. I know, he said, looking down at her with those kind eyes. Just like I know you didn't steal anything from Ethan Hawthorne except the spotlight he never deserved. Inside, Claire found her supporters waiting. Grace, Maggie, Victor, Rosa, and even Mrs. Crawford. We've got your back, Grace said, hugging her. And darling, Silver was definitely the right choice tonight. As they took their seats, Michael kept hold of her hand. In that moment, Claire realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. Despite Ethan's attempts to destroy her, despite the challenges and doubts, she was thriving, and she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with tension as the National Design Awards ceremony began. Claire sat between Michael and Grace, trying to keep her breathing steady. Her phone hadn't stopped vibrating with messages about Ethan's accusations. Ladies and gentlemen, the host announced, before we begin tonight's awards, we have a special guest who has requested to address the audience. Please welcome Mr. Ethan Hawthorne. Claire's hand tightened on Michael's as Ethan walked onto the stage. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, but his eyes still held that cruel confidence. Thank you, Ethan said into the microphone. I know my presence here is unexpected, but I felt it was my duty to address a serious issue in our industry. As some of you may have heard, I recently discovered evidence that designs from my company were stolen. A murmur went through the crowd. Claire felt all eyes turn to her. I have here, Ethan continued, holding up a folder, proof that Claire Bennett, while working as my maid, accessed confidential files and copied designs that she later claimed as her own. The Crawford penthouse, her supposed masterpiece, was actually designed by my team 3 years ago. That's a lie, Claire whispered, but Michael squeezed her hand. Wait, he whispered back. Trust me. Ethan was still speaking. I've provided the original drawings to the awards committee, dated and signed by my design team. It pains me to expose this deception, but our industry must maintain its integrity. Excuse me, Mr. Hawthorne, a new voice interrupted. James, Ethan's former friend, stood up from his seat near the stage. Would these be the original drawings you're referring to? He held up his phone, projecting something onto the large screen behind Ethan. The audience gasped. There was Ethan, clearly visible in security footage, placing documents into a file cabinet late at night. This footage is from last week, James explained, showing Mr. Hawthorne planting backdated drawings in his company's files. I had the security cameras, installed when I was still working there, concerned about exactly this kind of behavior. Ethan's face went pale. You're lying. And this, James continued, swiping to a new image, is an email from 3 years ago where Mr. Hawthorne specifically states that his company had no interest in the Crawford property or any similar projects at that time. The audience began to murmur louder. Ethan grabbed the microphone again. You don't understand. She's the fraud. She's the one who... That's enough, Ethan. Victor Montgomery stood up. The police are here, and they'd like to discuss your violation of bail conditions by approaching Miss Bennett's clients and tampering with the Crawford property. 2 police officers appeared at the side of the stage. Ethan looked around wildly, then pointed at Claire. This is all your fault. You were nothing but a maid. You should have stayed in your place. My place? Claire stood up slowly, her silver dress catching the light. My place is exactly where I... Geism, among talented professionals who earn their success through hard work and creativity, not through lies and intimidation. The audience burst into applause. Ethan tried to leave the stage, but the police officers were already there. As they led him away, Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The ceremony host returned to the microphone. Well, that was unexpected, but perhaps it's fitting that we move directly to our next award, Rising Star of the Year. Claire barely heard the introduction. Her mind was spinning with everything that had just happened. Michael's hand was warm in hers, and she could feel Grace and Maggie on her other side, all of them holding their breath. And the winner is... The host opened the envelope. In what our judges called the most unanimous decision in the category's history, Claire Bennett. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Claire felt Michael gently helping her to her feet, saw Grace wiping tears from her eyes, heard Rosa's distinctive whistle from somewhere in the crowd. As she walked to the stage, she remembered another walk that had changed her life. Down the stairs at the Hawthorne mansion, wearing a red dress. She'd been terrified then, but determined. Now she was neither. She was simply herself. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, holding her award. "But this doesn't belong just to me. It belongs to everyone who believed in me when I barely believed in myself." She looked out at her supporters, Grace, who had given her the red dress and so much more, Rosa, who had encouraged her dreams during long nights cleaning the mansion, the Montgomerys, who had given her a chance to prove herself, Michael, whose quiet strength had helped her face tonight's challenges. "Success isn't about where you start," she continued. "It's about daring to believe you deserve more. It's about having the courage to accept help when it's offered, and the grace to offer help when others need it." In the back of the room, she saw the young server from the charity ball, now wearing a chef's uniform from Grace's cafe, smiling proudly. "Someone once told me that the best revenge is success," Claire said, but they were wrong. The best revenge is showing others that success is possible, no matter where you come from. The applause was deafening. As Claire left the stage, she was immediately enveloped in hugs from her friends, her family, really. "I'm so proud of you," Grace whispered. "We all are," Maggie added, dabbing at her eyes. Michael waited until the others had finished congratulating her. Then he pulled her close and in front of everyone kissed her. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of the red dress," he admitted when they finally broke apart. "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed to become Claire Bennett, award-winning designer on your own, without any complications." Claire touched his cheek. "And now?" "Now?" He smiled. "Now I'm hoping Claire Bennett, award-winning designer, might want to have breakfast with me tomorrow, and maybe dinner the next day, and possibly the rest of her life after that." "That's quite a proposal, Mr. Drake. I'm hoping it's just the first of many." Later that night, as the celebration continued at Grace's boutique, Claire slipped away to the small garden behind the shop, the same garden where she'd once practiced walking in heels, preparing for that first party. She looked up at the stars, thinking about how far she'd come, from a maid with hidden dreams to an award-winning designer. From a woman afraid to take up space to someone who had just brought down one of the city's most powerful men. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Perfect," Claire said, accepting a glass. "I was just thinking about how life can change in an instant. Like when you put on a red dress, like when you decide to stop letting fear hold you back." She turned to face him. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing everyone what real strength looks like." Inside, they could hear their friends calling for them. Time for another toast, another celebration. Claire took Michael's hand and led him back inside. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was her story. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel buzzed with tension as the National Design Awards ceremony began. Claire sat between Michael and Grace, trying to keep her breathing steady. Her phone hadn't stopped, vibrating with messages about Ethan's accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced, "before we begin tonight's awards, we have a special guest who has requested to address the audience. Please welcome Mr. Ethan Hawthorne." Claire's hand tightened on Michael's as Ethan walked onto the stage. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, but his eyes still held that cruel confidence. "Thank you," Ethan said into the microphone. "I know my presence here is unexpected, but I felt it was my duty to address a serious issue in our industry. As some of you may have heard, I recently discovered evidence that designs from my company were stolen." A murmur went through the crowd. Claire felt all eyes turn to her. "I have here," Ethan continued, holding up a folder, "proof that Claire Bennett, while working as my maid, accessed confidential files and copied designs that she later claimed as her own. The Crawford penthouse, her supposed masterpiece, was actually designed by my team 3 years ago." "That's a lie," Claire whispered, But Michael squeezed her hand. "Wait," he whispered back. "Trust me." Ethan was still speaking. "I've provided the original drawings to the awards committee, dated and signed by my design team. It pains me to expose this deception, but our industry must maintain its integrity." "Excuse me, Mr. Hawthorne," a new voice interrupted. James, Ethan's former friend, stood up from his seat near the stage. "Would these be the original drawings you're referring to?" He held up his phone, projecting something onto the large screen behind Ethan. The audience gasped. There was Ethan, clearly visible in security footage, placing documents into a file cabinet late at night. "This footage is from last week," James explained, showing Mr. Hawthorne planting backdated drawings in his company's files. "I had the security cameras installed when I was still working there, concerned about exactly this kind of behavior." Ethan's face went pale. "You're lying." "And this," James continued, swiping to a new image, "is an email from 3 years ago where Mr. Hawthorne specifically states that his company had no interest in the Crawford property or any similar projects at that time." The audience began to murmur louder. Ethan grabbed the microphone again. "You don't understand. She's the fraud. She's the one who—" "That's enough, Ethan." Victor Montgomery stood up. "The police are here, and they'd like to discuss your violation of bail conditions by approaching Miss Bennett's clients and tampering with the Crawford property." 2 police officers appeared at the side of the stage. Ethan looked around wildly, then pointed at Claire. "This is all your fault. You were nothing but a maid. You should have stayed in your place." "My place?" Claire stood up slowly, her silver dress catching the light. "My place is exactly where I am, among talented professionals who earn their success through hard work and creativity, not through lies and intimidation." The audience burst into applause. Ethan tried to leave the stage, but the police officers were already there. As they led him away, Claire felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The ceremony host returned to the microphone. "Well, that was unexpected, but perhaps it's fitting that we move directly to our next award, Rising Star of the Year." Claire barely heard the introduction. Her mind was spinning with everything that had just happened. Michael's hand was warm in hers, and she could feel Grace and Maggie on her other side, all of them holding their breath. "And the winner is—" The host opened the envelope. In what our judges called the most unanimous decision in the category's history, Claire Bennett. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Claire felt Michael gently helping her to her feet, saw Grace wiping tears from her eyes, heard Rosa's distinctive whistle from somewhere in the crowd. As she walked to the stage, she remembered another walk that had changed her life, down the stairs at the Hawthorne mansion, wearing a red dress. She'd been terrified then, but determined. Now she was neither. She was simply herself. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, holding her award. "But this doesn't belong just to me. It belongs to everyone who believed in me when I barely believed in myself." She looked out at her supporters. Grace, who had given her the red dress, and so much more. Rosa, who had encouraged her dreams during long nights cleaning the mansion. The Montgomerys, who had given her a chance to prove herself. Michael, whose quiet strength had helped her face tonight's challenges. "Success isn't about where you start," she continued. "It's about daring to believe. You deserve more. It's about having the courage to accept help when it's offered, and the grace to offer help when others need it." In the back of the room, she saw the young server from the charity ball, now wearing a chef's uniform from Grace's cafe, smiling proudly. "Someone once told me that the best revenge is success," Claire said, "but they were wrong. The best revenge is showing others that success is possible, no matter where you come from." The applause was deafening. As Claire left the stage, she was immediately enveloped in hugs from her friends. Her family, really. "I'm so proud of you," Grace whispered. "We all are," Maggie added, dabbing at her eyes. Michael waited until the others had finished congratulating her. Then he pulled her close and, in front of everyone, kissed her. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of the red dress," he admitted, when they finally broke apart. "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed to become Claire Bennett, award-winning designer on your own, without any complications." Claire touched his cheek. "And now?" "Now?" He smiled. "Now I'm hoping Claire Bennett, award-winning designer, might want to have breakfast with me tomorrow, and maybe dinner the next day, and possibly the rest of her life after that." "That's quite a proposal, Mr. Drake. I'm hoping it's just the first of many." Later that night, as the celebration continued at Grace's boutique, Claire slipped away to the small garden behind the shop. The same garden where she'd once practiced walking in heels, preparing for that first party. She looked up at the stars, thinking about how far she'd come, from a maid with hidden dreams to an award-winning designer, from a woman afraid to take up space to someone who had just brought down one of the city's most powerful men. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, joining her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Perfect," Claire said, accepting a glass. "I was just thinking about how life can change in an instant. Like when you put on a red dress. Like when you decide to stop letting fear hold you back." She turned to face him. "Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for showing everyone what real strength looks like." Inside, they could hear their friends calling for them. Time for another toast, another celebration. Claire took Michael's hand and led him back inside. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was her story.